Gittin Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph. Stories and souvenirs. Mpihem velo מכתבם. This is all over Shas. We actually had a Matmonim on the sugya with a slightly different angle back in April last year on Yevomis Daf Lamed Aleph. And when we get to the point where all the shiurim are properly tagged and searchable, you'll be able to put in a search for Mpihem velo מכתבם, and you'll get the two shiurim side by side. You'll get part one and you'll get part two. At this point, they're separated in different masechtas, and they're separated in over a year apart one from the other. It's just a good example of the importance of the project that we're doing, to be able to then, one's learning the sugya, a person anywhere is learning the sugya and wants to go see what we did and how we approached it, they'll be able to pull up all the relevant ones. It's a shas sugya, it's huge, and the challenge today is to focus down and get to the essence of it. So much has been written on it, so much has been argued and discussed and debated on it through the generations. So in 15 or 20 minutes to get to the essence of it, that's the first challenge. And the second challenge, of course, is to see chokhmas chayim in it. It's a technical issue in halakha. And how do we find life wisdom in it? How do we learn from this piece of Gemara about stories and souvenirs? And what's it got to do with this piece of Gemara where we're learning about shtarot, how documents work, how edut works? In this case, it works both ways. Not only do we extrapolate an understanding of how we recreate our realities through both narrative and through souvenirs and the difference between them, but understanding the difference between a story and a souvenir. You come back from an overseas trip and you're having dinner with your friends, you tell them stories about where you were. That's one way that you can do it, right? Isn't that right, Joe? You've got lots and lots of stories about your travels, or you tell stories. But you also, don't you bring souvenirs back as well sometimes when you go to interesting places? My wife insists wherever we go, we buy something. It doesn't matter how small, how inexpensive, it doesn't matter, but we bring something tangible back from the places where we visited. That's a souvenir. It's another way of recreating the reality, and understanding that in life gives us an angle to this sugya, which is very unique and solves a lot of problems. Let's have a look at it. The issue is as following. As far as we have a posuk in Parashat Shoftim that we have to use witnesses in court. Al pishnei edim or al pishlosha edim yakum davar. You recreate a reality where you weren't present, but you've got to make a decision on because you're a dayan on a beis din. You do that by means of edim. Says Rashi, velo sheyichtavu edutam. And we learn in the Gemara that means it's got to be mpihem. They've got to recreate the reality by oral narrative. It can't be in written narrative form. And we learn that in the Gemara in Yevomis and elsewhere. Mpihem velo מכתבם. It's got to be from their mouth and not, they can't send a letter in. They can't send a document in. An affidavit. Affidavits don't work. You've got to have the witness standing there and telling the story in front of the Eidim, in front of the Dayanim, so the Dayanim can question and engage in conversation with the Eidim. This recreation of a reality that took place, but we don't know about it, to make it real again requires oral narrative. That's the posuk in Shoftim. On the other hand, we have a posuk in Yirmiyahu on which the Gemara bases the whole principle of shtarot. Sadot bekesef yiknu v'chatov b'sefer v'chatom. The Novi Yirmiyahu says when we get into Eretz Yisrael, we will deal in property. We will buy and sell properties using shtarot, using documents. And we know from Gittin, the posuk in Parashas Kitetse, which is the underlying principle of the whole Masechta we're learning. V'chatav la sefer kritut v'natan biyadeh. If a woman turns up and she says, I'm a divorcee, and we say, how do we know you're a divorcee? She wants to remarry, she pulls out her get and she shows us. So those are examples of written evidence. I challenge your ownership of the property. You pull out a document that shows that you're the owner. That's written evidence. So this whole sugya that we're talking about is the tension between these two psukim. On the one hand, we're told that the only way to recreate reality is through oral evidence, and on the other hand, we see there's a role for written documentation, such as in the case of Gittin and property transactions, and Kiddushin, when a man marries a woman using shtar as one of the methods of marrying her. We know that from the Torah, that's proper Kiddushin. That's Kiddushin d'oraisa, so we know the Torah allows certain documentation, and yet we're told that for evidence we can't use documentation. It has to be oral. Says the Rambam in Hilchos Edus, Din Torah she'ein mekablim edut lo b'dinei mamonot v'lo b'dinei nafashot ela mipi ha'idim. It's right that the Torah says that you've got to have oral evidence. Nothing else can take its place. Shene'emar al pishnayim edim mipim v'lo miktav yadan. Aval midivrei sofrim, but the rabbis said, shechotchin dinei mamonot be'idut shebishtar, that you can make commercial decisions, halachic decisions in matters of commerce, based on a document. Why? To facilitate commerce. And we've had examples of this before, that the Torah gives us the essence, the way it should be as an ideal. Ideally, we should recreate reality through conversation and through oral evidence. But people want to transact, and they don't know there'll always be witnesses present, and the witness will still be alive. So in order to facilitate commerce, in order to make the laws of the Torah practical in the world in which we live, the Chachomim had to introduce certain laws, and in this case they introduced the laws of shtar. Says the Rambam. Reb Chaim, we've actually learned this Reb Chaim before. Reb Chaim says, that, because everybody asks on the Rambam, what do you mean a shtar is? We've just had a posuk from Yirmiyahu about a shtar. We know that a shtar works with kiddushin. We know a shtar works with gittin. What are you talking about? A shtar is the Rabbanan. And that kasha really the Ramban asks on the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, in Shor Sheni of Sefer HaMitzvahs. That's where the discussion starts. The Ramban challenging the Rambam and saying, we've got sources in the Torah for shtarot. Explains Reb Chaim, you might remember there are two kinds of shtarot. There's a shtar riyah, there's a shtar ra'ayah, and a shtar kinyan. There's a shtar that affects the transaction, and there is a shtar, a document that is evidence of a transaction. So when you use a get, the get affects the transaction. Without the document, there's no divorce. Without the document, there's no kiddushin. And sometimes a shtar is evidence. Eidim write on a document, we were present last year when so-and-so lent so-and-so money in our presence. They're giving evidence, but they're giving the evidence in writing. Says the Reb Chaim, this which the Rambam says that shtarot are used midrabanan, that's only a shtar ra'ayah, when the document is being used to prove that an event took place. It's data. We're getting the data on something that happened. We're recreating an event that took place. But when the shtar is the instrument with which the transaction took place, you can't do gittin without a get. You can't do kiddushin bishtar without a document. If you were koine karka, if you acquired land using a shtar, that's a different kind of a shtar. That's a shtar kinyan. That's a shtar where the shtar is the instrument, not the evidence. And when the shtar is the instrument, not the evidence, that's not what the Rambam is talking about. In such a case, this is midoraita. That's what Yirmiyahu means when he says that there'll be sadot bekesef yiknu v'chatov b'sefer v'chatom. That's how Reb Chaim learns the Rambam. The Baal HaMaor answers differently. The Baal HaMaor, 12th century, southern France, writes a complex work on the Rif. You remember the Rif was the North African style, and he went to Sfarad, and he writes the Rif, where, like the Rambam, there are no reasons given. The Rif just summarizes the Gemara and brings out the halakhic conclusions from the Gemara, but he doesn't take us through his mental process. We have to reconstruct it. The Baalei Tosfos, the European school, was all about mental process. So that's what Tosfos is. Tosfos takes us through the mental process of learning. That's why learning Tosfos is so important, because without learning Tosfos, you're not getting the mental process of how to learn. And the Baal HaMaor basically is like the Tosfos on the Rif. He reconstructs how the Rif must have learned, and he challenges the Rif, and he brings different opinions on the Rif. The Ramban writes the Milchama, is also on the page of the Rif, defending the Rif against the attacks of the Baal HaMaor. Remember, the Ramban came from the school of the Rif in Spain. We talked about the Rimi Gash, how the Talmud of the Rif established the school in Spain. The Ramban then was part of that school, and from that came the Rashbo and the Ra'o and the Nimika Yosef and the Ran and so on. So that was all, and the Ramban supports the Rif against the attacks of the Baal HaMaor. Anyway, the Baal HaMaor asks this question, as does the Rif. The Rif gives an answer, the Baal HaMaor disagrees with his answer, and he says the difference is mipik tavam hu shipsula edutan, aval mipik tavo lo. He makes an interesting distinction. He said when the reality is being recreated by their writing, that's the psul, that's the disqualification of mipiem velo miktavam. If they're recreating the reality, they need to use their mouths. It's got to be oral, it can't be written. But where the Baal Dover himself, where the lender creates the reality, he writes the document at the time of the loan. That's different. That's not witnesses who come along and say, we're giving evidence. Nobody knows about this. We two are the only ones who were there. We can give evidence that such and such a thing took place. So the reality is being reconstructed by the witnesses. But in the case of a shtar, in the case of a loan where he writes a shtar, that's mipik tavo, not mipik tavam. The Baal HaMaor is medayek, is very meticulous about the words of the Gemara in Yevomas. Mipiem velo mipik tavam, in the plural. You can't, if they wrote down their evidence, then their evidence is not valid because it's written instead of oral. But that doesn't mean mipik tavo. If the person himself writes, I am borrowed from so-and-so $1,000 on such and such a date and such a place, and the Eidim sign that, who's creating that reality? It's the lender, it's the borrower who's creating that reality. That, says the Baal HaMaor, is different. So hold that there. We've got two answers now as to why shtar works. What was our question? Our question was, it says, if there's evidence, got to be oral. Got a posuk for that. And yet we've also got psukim that sometimes written evidence works. Says the Reb Chaim explaining the Rambam, it doesn't work for evidence, it works when the shtar is used as an instrument of transaction. Then you're allowed to use a written document. But if it's to recreate an event about which we have no other knowledge other than the knowledge of the Eidim, that has to be shared with us orally, it can't be shared with us in writing. That's how the Rambam, according to Reb Chaim, answers it. And then we've got the Baal HaMaor, who says that it's not all that different, as we're going to see, where the Baal HaMaor says if it's the witnesses, two witnesses creating a reality about which we have no knowledge, it has to be orally, it can't be in writing. But mipik tavo, if it's an individual who's telling us, is creating his own reality by means of the document, then that's not covered by the prohibition, by the disqualification of mipik tavam, mipim velo mipik tavam. Rashi in our Gemara, now we finally come to our Gemara. Rashi in our Gemara says something that people struggle with. The Achronim all struggle with what Rashi really means. And the case is as follows. Rav Kahana says a din. If there's a cheresh, a person who can't speak and can't hear, but originally he was able to, so he married a woman when he was normal. Then he lost his speech and his hearing. So now he has the din of a cheresh. If he yachol ledaber mitoch haktav, if he can write what his intention is, and he says, give my wife a get and sign on the get, I want to divorce my wife, and he writes it all down for us, he can't say it. Says Rav Kahana, we act on that. There's a whole discussion about that. So Rav Kahana sees the written word as a form of communication, as saying, he's actually saying that. Ask Rabbi Zeri, Kashili, I've got a kasha on Rav Kahana. Because we said him, Lo yagid prat li'ilem sheno yachol la'agid, amaya yachol la'agid mitoch haktav. That there's an issur if a person knows evidence and refuses to come to Beis Din to give the evidence he knows, that's an issur d'oraisa. Says the Gemara, but not if he's a cheresh. If he can't speak and he can't hear, then he's not obligated. He's not over the issur d'oraisa, clearly in such a case. Asks Rabbi Zera, why not? He could write it. If writing is a form of oral communication, if you can tell me your thoughts by writing, why can't a witness do it by writing? You're asking from witnessing, that's different. That's the Gemara. Rashi says on that, what does it mean, mipim velo ktavim? Ya'idu beveis din, they've got to come to Beis Din and give evidence, and that has to be oral, that can't be in writing. And here Rashi brings his view. Delo dami lishtar, you might ask me as the Ramban asked the Rambam, and as the Rif asks, and as the Baal HaMaor asks. You might ask me also, then how does a shtar work? If evidence has to be in Beis Din and it has to be oral, how does a document work? How does a get work? How does a shtar kiddushin work? Says Rashi, it's not the same, because a shtar shechatmuhu beyomo dahau urche lachi. When a transaction is effected by means of a shtar written at the time, it's not done later on giving evidence about a historic event. It was written at the time. When the shtar is written at the time, that's the way, these are the important words in Rashi, dahau urche lachi, that's the way it's done. And there's an Avnei Nezer, and there's a Chidush Harim, and there are all sorts of interesting people who try and work out what Rashi means and what Rashi's view is, and it gets incredibly complicated. The key to it is the Ktsos HaChoshen, where the Ktsos HaChoshen says, V'hinei b'zeh shevchotchin dinei mamonot b'yidush shtar, a very classical Ktsos HaChoshen in Siman Kafchet. And he says, this that you're allowed to use a written document, as we know, matzinu arba'a shitot, there are 4 shitos in the Rishonim, 4 different views. And he enumerates them. View number 1 is Rashi and the Baal HaMaor. View number 2 is the Ramban. View number 3 is Rabbeinu Tam. View number 4 is the Rambam. And then he asks on all of them. That's the Ktsos HaChoshen. Everybody has difficulty with the Ktsos HaChoshen. How is he lumping Rashi and the Baal HaMaor together? Rashi says here the reason it works is Dilodam Yishtar Beyomot was written on that day, and how urche, that's the way it's done. The Baal HaMaor says it's different because it's not the din of Mipik Tavam, that you're not allowed to do it by their written evidence, is a din specifically in Eidut, where two witnesses are coming to Beis Din to give evidence. That can't be in writing. But Mipik Tavo, an individual can write something, and that writing is valid. And certainly that document is valid. That's what the Baal HaMaor says. They're two different approaches. And what I want to suggest to you is that you see from the Ktsos HaChoshen that here's a way of us understanding Rashi and the Baal HaMaor the same way. And I want to add to that, if you understand the Rambam like Reb Chaim understands the Rambam, then the three Shitot are actually one Shita. What are the three Shitot? The three Shitot is that there are two ways of recreating reality. The one is through narrative and the other is through a souvenir. What's the difference? Narrative is two people come along, or you pull out a history that was written 200 years ago about something that happened 300 years ago. And the whole history, there's a narrative that explains, that describes the whole history, and you establish the credibility of the author, and you have information. Now you know that something happened. But what happens when an archaeologist finds an artifact from 1,000 years ago, or from 700 years ago? That's not proof that it happened. That's a piece of history in your hand. That's what a souvenir is. If you come back and you tell me the story about your trip to the Himalayas, I listen to your story and I can picture it in my mind. That's the narrative. But when you show me a piece of stone that you took off the peak of Mount Everest and you put in your pocket, this is the stone, this is where it comes from. Or you show me a moon rock, this is a piece of rock from the moon. This is not evidence that you were on the moon. This is it. This is history itself. You're touching history. You're touching the event. That's what a souvenir is. You bring back something, you bring back a piece of your experience. A narrative is you recreate your experience. There are two different ways of recreating. A shtar, the way the Rambam understands it according to Reb Chaim, the way the Baal HaMaor understands it, and the way Rashi stands it. This is not something that is a narrative later on about something which happened then. This was written at the moment. This is history. This is, imagine that you have a shtar written by the Rambam and signed by the Rambam. You wouldn't look at it and say, oh, interesting, so the Rambam borrowed $100. That's not what's amazing. What's amazing is you're holding a document that the Rambam wrote, the Rambam held. You're holding a manuscript. Manuscript's different from a piece of printed paper. You're holding the manuscript. This is history itself. That's what a shtar is. A shtar is it's not a recreation of a piece of history. It is the piece of history which you're now holding in your hand. That's not what mipik tavam means. Mipik tavam means when you recreate the history, telling a narrative, telling the story. That's not what mipik tavam is. When Eidim come, they're actually telling a story. If they're telling a story, the din is, the Gzerat HaKatuv is, that story has to be oral. The Beis Din has to hear the story from them and has to be able to transact with them. And so that's important to know also in the way we deal with memories and the way we deal with communicating memories, that they're two different ways. And a lot of what we do today is narrative, and that's okay, but we shouldn't lose the tangible. We get so involved in the digital. The digital is recreating the narrative, telling a story. You take a selfie of yourself at the Himalayas, well, maybe it was Photoshop, maybe it wasn't, who knows? It's a story. You're telling your story. But when you bring a piece of rock back, that's no story. Now somebody is able to participate in the event itself. And sometimes we need to do that. Sometimes we need to be alert and aware of the importance of bringing the past into the present by means of souvenir, by means of real, tangible, physical things. And we do get excited. That's why we go to museums, to see the original thing. We want to see the original thing, to feel it, to touch it, to see it. And the other is by telling a story, photographs and story about what one saw and what one heard, and to be able to give the correct chashivus to souvenirs, to that which is a real recreation, a real bringing of history into the present, and how important that is in our lives and in our learning.